Joel Smith for JustFlySports.com, talking to you today about the difference between knee-dominant athletes and hip-dominant athletes. I've written some articles recently highlighting the difference between the squat and the deadlift in terms of the training of sprinters, and how the squat's a knee-dominant lift typically, and the deadlift is a hip-dominant lift. But I want to kind of go further into that. So first, let's talk about athletes. What's the difference between a knee-dominant athlete and a hip-dominant athlete? Well, the truth is it lies all in the shin angles. So what's the shin angle? Real quick, all it is the angle that my shin makes with the ground. Right now it would be 90 degrees. This here would be a shin angle of about 45. Okay, you can see that my shin is now at a 45-degree angle with the ground. You know, and I could go through a full spectrum. Okay, now the big thing, the number one thing that classifies a knee-dominant athlete is when they walk, when they run, when they lift. They're going to, or jumping especially, probably jumping the biggest, is they are going to exhibit a very large degree of forward shin angle. Okay, ask a knee-dominant athlete to squat, and instantly you're going to see a lot of knees over the toes. Granted, we typically coach athletes to sit back, that's the correct form, but you'll find that despite cueing that sit back, the knee-dominant athlete will really tend to put those knees over the ankles. On the other hand, hip-dominant athletes tend to be, just because of the nature of what they do, they tend to be very tight back in here because they're not used to having their knees go very far forward. They're used to, in all their movements, whether it be jumping, squatting, they're used to sitting back, okay? And they, like if they're going to jump, they sit back. If they're going to squat, they sit back. You're not going to see these athletes get here because one, they're usually too tight, and two, because their power's back here, okay? So that's the biggest difference. Now you'll find that in a lot of methods, which I'll explain later in this video. And the last way is just watch an athlete walk. Typically, you know, if somebody is real big here and small here, they're going to usually be a hip dominant. The reason why is they walk with a very vertical shin angle. They'll pull the ground under them, whereas a quad dominant athlete tends to walk with shin angles that are more forward. So they're almost bouncing along. So sometimes you'll see people who kind of seem to bounce up and down when they walk. That's usually going to be the quad or knee dominant athlete. On top of that, usually quad dominant walkers will have bigger calves too because they're used to bending their leg and then pushing off. Okay, so that's why a lot of times you'll see athletes with real big hips, small calves. It's just a lot of it's found in the way that an athlete walks. So obviously weight training will serve to balance things out, but walking has a big place in determining that type of athlete. So what are some pros and cons of being a hip-dominant athlete or a knee-dominant athlete? Well, big-time pros, let's say hip-dominant first. What's the good parts of being a hip-dominant athlete? Well, first off is top-end speed and speed in general. Go to a track meet and watch the best sprinters. More likely than not, they're going to be more hip-dominant, especially the 400-meter runners, where speed and efficiency is concerned. Those athletes are almost always going to be very hip-dominant. In fact, you're not going to be able to get away with being a knee-dominant athlete for long if you want to get to the elite levels of being a sprinter. On the other hand, knee dominance is real nice for vertical jumping. If you watch a volleyball game, watch some great leapers in basketball, a lot of times, especially two-leg, like vertical leapers, that type of thing, they're going to be very knee dominant. They're going to have a very strong knee bend and use that knee bend to project themselves vertically. But what's some negative sides of this though? Well, for knee dominant, one thing is tendonitis. If you're a knee dominant athlete and you're chronically using your knees as the foremost power to jump, you're going to oftentimes develop tendonitis. Also, if you're knee dominant, you're probably not going to be as fast. You're just not going to be able to pull the ground through effectively. And it tends to run in negative cycles too. If I'm a knee dominant athlete my whole life and I really do nothing to address my issues, when I squat, get in the weight room, do plyometrics, I will do that in a knee-dominant manner, and thus I'll continue to strengthen my quads and neglect my hips. On the flip side of things, if I'm a hip-dominant athlete and I do everything hip-dominant, I squat hip-dominant, obviously running, and well, for sprinting you wouldn't really want to change it, but acceleration is a different story. If I do everything hip-dominant, I'm probably going to hurt my ability to jump vertically, as well as the fact I'm probably going to get stiff calves, and that can cause problems further up the kinetic chain. So what do I do to correct it, okay, in terms of corrective exercise? And before I jump into corrective exercise real quick, I will say that there are exceptions to the rule. Sometimes knee dominant athletes, as what probably happens to a lot of them, they get tendonitis. Because of this, they have to change the way they squat. So sometimes you'll see athletes squatting almost completely back like this, just because they're so used to their knees blowing up, they have no other choice. So sometimes we kind of morph as we go along our athletic journey, but for the most part, from what I've seen, the average athlete, especially the average athlete who hasn't either had a lot of weightlifting experience or hasn't been instructed correctly, they will carry their characteristics with them. I personally think that, there's awesome knee dominant athletes out there, and there's awesome hip dominant athletes out there. So what's the need to change? I think you can get away with being great with what you do have, but there's no reason you can't get better. And I think the ultimate, now it depends, if you're a track sprinter, stay hip dominant, that's fine. If I just want to do the great standing vertical jump, stay knee dominant, that's okay. But I feel like ultimately the best place is somewhere in the middle. So how do I change that? Well, let's take, for example, a trap bar deadlift and see how we can manipulate that exercise to kind of bring these athletes on the outside extremes to somewhere in the middle. So I have a trap bar right here. So I'll set this up here real quick. Wasting a couple seconds of video, but not too terribly difficult. So notice I'm stepping the bar. We'll take the camera to the side here so you can look at me from the side. Now, this is probably, in my opinion, the easiest way to change how an athlete does a lift. Put a bar on someone's back and ask them to do a certain thing with their shins, and it can be very difficult. But with the trap bar, all you have to do is squat right down, and you can manipulate your shins however you want. So, for me, naturally, I'm going to be kind of a mix of both. My knees are a little bit over my toes naturally. Okay, so a little quad dominant here. I can change that just by sitting back and making sure my knees, stay over my laces. Okay, so now I've just changed this from more of a knee-based lift to a more hip-based lift. Okay. On the other hand, if I get an athlete who I feel like I want to unlock their quad power a little bit more, and they're chronically, going like this and using their hips and their back, to change hip dominant athletes to knee dominant, you've got to work on flexibility here on the ankles. Otherwise, you're never really going to be able to unlock your quads. So that's just one example. Something you're going to notice too is watch how your athletes do Olympic lifts. A hang clean there's no hiding where you're dominant when you watch an athlete do a hang clean. So push this out of the way real quick. So oftentimes you'll have athletes, you'll tell them to get in the power position, right? Hips back. Okay. When they clean the bar, especially when the weight gets heavy, your knee dominant athletes are going to instantly get here. Why? The reason why is their power is here, it's not here. So expecting them to push heavy weight like this is not going to happen. They have to go to where they have the most muscle. So what they'll do is look at here, get this angle big and then pull. Well, it lifts the weight, but is it accomplishing what we're trying to do? And that also gets even worse when they're like bringing the weight down. If you do a hang clean and bring the weight down, they're also going to do this a lot, just because that's where their body's power is. So for these athletes, my remedy is typically kettlebell swings with perfect technique. Okay, so getting here, keeping the shins vertical, sticking the hips back. Knee dominant athletes, if you have them do a kettlebell swing, love to do this. It's very wired into their system. So the kettlebell swing is one way I can take these athletes and start teaching them to unlock those hips a little bit more. Usually hip dominant athletes have the hang clean down pretty well. It's just the full catch that they're going to struggle with. So one more thing too, in terms of knee dominant, hip dominant, my last little point of this video is being a mix of both makes you a better squatter. If I'm a knee dominant athlete, I'm going to probably be great at getting to rock bottom squats. The only problem is I'm not going to be using this motor to push me so much. It's going to be almost all quads. Okay? If I'm a hip dominant athlete, I'm going to be using the right motor, but I'm not going to be able to hit good depth because usually my knees aren't going to be able to get out very far. So embracing some aspects of both is going to assist your squats And really what it comes down to is, if I'm hip dominant, I'm not using my full potential here. If I'm knee dominant, I'm not using my full potential back here. So with any athlete, it's really not so much you have to be in the middle, but I want you to use your full potential with the muscles that you've been given. That's it for this video. I hope that helps you out. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment box. I'll try to get back to you as quickly as I can. Until next time, this is Joel Smith from JustFlySports.com.